Okay, welcome back. We started speaking last week about the Yerushalmi on Kodshim, the scam, the fraud, the Yerushalmi on Kodshim that was written by Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander, Hamachon El Ghazi. I see we have some new people, so let's just recap, I guess, the basic storyline. There's many more details to add and flesh out about his personality and his literary output, and then I also would like to get to today some of the, so to speak, the halachic and limud related discussions that this Yerushalmi played a role in, and I guess, so to speak, why it was such a successful fraud for the short time that it was, and so many Gedolei Yisrael were taken in by it, and put that into context a little bit. So last week we mentioned that in 1905 or 1906, an ad came out in the periodicals by someone who called himself Shlomo Yehuda Sat Ghazi, El Ghazi, so to speak, pretending that he came from the, illustrious Sephardic El Ghazi family, and saying through an elaborate backstory that he constructed where exactly he discovered the manuscript for the long missing ancient text of the Yerushalmi on Kodshim, and joyfully announcing to the Eilam HaTorah that it has been discovered and he was going to put it out. And then he put out volume 2, which I believe was Chulin and Bechiris, and later on, a year later, he put out volume 1, which was Zvachim and Erechin, and I could be fajumbling the Masechtas, but in any case, he started with Kodshim Chelik Beis first, and then he went back to Kodshim Chelik Aleph, and he put out the whole set. Now in it, he collected Haskamas from various Gedolei Rabbanim in Hungary. Primarily, the biggest amongst them was the Marsham, Reb Shalom Shvadron of Berajan, who we've spoken about in the past, who was a Goyin Olam and a Talmud Chacham Muflig, and probably the Pesach Hadar, or something of that variety. And he was taken by this Yerushalmi and even contributed some Haggayis on it. And because of these collection of Haskamas that he got from local Rabbanim, Yerushalmi was well received, and many Talmidei Chachamim, primarily, and shuls and meistes, etc., started trying to purchase copies of this Yerushalmi. Now, over time, as we mentioned last week, first some of the Chachamim and their Israelite and other Chaykrim, Rabbanim who had some scholarly training, like Rabbi Dr. Ritter, and others, who realized that not everything checked out over here, sign out on the product and sign out on the person, and they, so to speak, outed him and started to spread the word that this was a fraud. The Chidushei Harim, as we mentioned last week, got a hold of a copy of one of these and asked it to be translated into Lashon Kodesh, because it was written in German. He translated it to Lashon Kodesh, and they read it. And ultimately, the one from the purely Rabbani world, who really came out swinging and put this Yerushalmi in its place, was Reb Meir Don Plotsky, the Mechaber of the Kli Chemda, who was a Goyin and very close to the Gerach Sidus. As a matter of fact, he at some point in his life, he quit his Rabbanus and he went to Varsha to become a Gerach Shiva. He was very close to the Re'emes, a big Goyin, and he put out a sefer called Shalu Shleim Yerushalayim, and in it, he so to speak, somewhat demolished the credibility of Friedlander and of his find and of this. Now, what's interesting is, and this is an ironic detail, is that Shalu Shleim Yerushalayim is really a collection of Reb Meir Don Plotsky's Haggayis on this new Yerushalmi, meaning he clearly himself took this Yerushalmi very seriously and was very excited about it and wrote Haggayis on it, only later on, at some point, discovering that it was fake. Now, how he discovered it was fake is because he looking to go into business selling them together with the Chidushei Harim, requested that Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander provide some sort of receipts, documents, show where the Ksav Yad is, show a piece of the Ksav Yad, and after getting several clinching excuses, he realized it was never forthcoming, and he went public with the fact that it's fake. Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander published under various pseudonyms, that alleged to be Talmidim of his, harsh and scathing critiques of the Kli Chemda and others who dared to question his credibility and the find that he had over here, but it was to no avail, and ultimately, once the Eilam caught on, they caught on. Now, just to add a little bit more to the character that is Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander, just stam because it's interesting, there's a Kuntris sefer called Sufa V'Saira from Talmud Chacham Eretz Yisrael, Tobias, who Chanoich Tobias. He has a very journalistic bent to him, long articles, and in there he has like a half a volume about the fake Yerushalmi, and he compiles a lot of the biographical details of Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander, and they're interesting. Meaning, it seems he was born with the name Zusya in a small town on the outskirts of Vitebsk in Belarus, possibly to a Lubavitcher family, possibly to a Litvischer family. At different points in his life, he alleged to have learned in Volozhin. Other times he said he didn't learn in Volozhin. He was married first. He probably had 4 children. Some of them were killed in the Holocaust. Some of them moved to Sweden, I believe. He was not in the happiest of marriages. It seems he abandoned his wife for a good amount of time. And when she would write to him, when he's coming home, he would have the dog ate my homework type of excuses. He didn't have the money. He was ill. He was this. He was that. And, he wasn't looking to come home. It seems that at some point early in his career, possibly his first contribution to the literary world, was he put out a book called Tikkun. Now, Tikkun is what, Chassidim call a l'chaim after davening, like a Tikkun. And it was a book that was put out in the style of the maskilic literature to mock the Chassidim. And in it he collected various, again, mostly fraudulent things that he created to try to embarrass Chassidim. He published this, but again, because he was such a pathological liar, depending on who his audience was, he would either deny that he ever wrote it, or he would take credit for it, meaning like if he was talking to a maskilic audience that he thought would approve of the fact that he went after the Chassidim, so he would take credit for it. If he thought he was talking to an Olam that was a little more traditional and sounds sensitive to these things, he would deny ever knowing anything about it. He later published a She'iltis, not a She'iltis, that also, but he published a Tosefta. He tried to put out Shisha Sidri Tosefta. Tosefta, as we know, is published in the back of the Gemara, usually after the Rif, and Ad Kedei Kach, for a long period of time, people, I think, connected the two of them, simple people. The Tosefta was never published and with Mefarshim on it properly, and Mamela, he tried to put out Shisha Sidri Tosefta, like a brand new Tosefta, but as was his Mahalach, he was less than scrupulous when it came to making edits. If something didn't sit right to him, he would just edit and amend it as he saw fit, and claim that he had kisvayadis and sources for the things. He'd add a line, take out a line, add a few lines. His Pirush Cheshik Shlema that he wrote on Yerushalmi and Tosefta and also She'iltis, he would it would be liberally interspersed. He was not a credible producer, and that got him in trouble. And ultimately, all these, so to speak, skeletons in his closet caught up with him and outed him, as the fabricator of the Yerushalmi. Now, interestingly, and this is like alluded to between the lines, and I don't know what to make of it, but alluded to between the lines is seems to be some sort of impropriety where he would reach out to women who were agunis, women whose husbands were away for a long time, and involve himself with them and suggest that he'd be able to free them and help them and get them the help they needed. Now, I didn't see anyone explicit, reading between the lines, there seems to be something there. So he was a character of, let's say, highly questionable character, and who had a littered past full of, fraudulent attempts to contribute to the literary world. And when all this was strung together, the shoddiness of his product and the major skeletons in his closets and cloud over his reputation, there was no recovering from this, and he retired to the city of Satmar, where he was living at the time. And I think his life wound to a natural end there. I don't know exactly what year he was nifter, but I think he was buried in Satmar. And he was close to certain, old chacham from Satmar, like Yehuda Greenwald, who wrote about him and only much later in life acknowledged that he was a fraudster. In any case, this is the story of Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander and his Yerushalmi. Now, like we mentioned last week and like we're mentioning today, the Yerushalmi on Kodshim that he produced was received to great acclaim, contrary to what I guess people like the narrative to be, that everyone saw through it right away, and each gadol and each cries in their own way. Contrary to that, the Yerushalmi was actually pretty well received by many of the Gedolei Yisrael, and many Gedolim quoted it in their Svarim that were published in the early 1900s. Let's say from the Kli Chemda, or the Ostrav Tzigoyin, Reb Meir Yechiel, or the Munchas Alazar, or even the Dvar Avram and Reb Nachum Weinfeld, meaning the Chabina's brother. And this is just like a list of sorts. This is not an exhaustive list. Many Gedolim quoted from him in their Svarim and were very taken by it. Additionally, L'chaira, the Imrei Emes, at a certain point, as we spoke last week, was taken by it. It's possible that the Rogachev and Nar Sameach, for a short amount of time, there's a Messiah, and this is something questionable and needs more research, but there is a Messiah that the Chavetz Chaim, who later on in life, the last third of the Chavetz Chaim's life, he was makbid to put on Tefillin Dereinu Tam, possibly started putting on Tefillin Dereinu Tam because in the Yerushalmi and Kodshim that Friedlander produced, the Seder Aparshius is like Rabbeinu Tam, and therefore the Chafetz Chaim might have felt that it was lemechesh miboy. Now, although of course the Chafetz Chaim later on became aware that this was a fraud, but once he started doing it, and it is on Hagateva, and it is a day in the Rishonim, and the Mechaber says that the Bal Nefesh Yachmer, so the Chafetz Chaim stuck with it, and he kept on the minig of wearing tefillin Rabbeinu Tam. Now, Yiyach Shiyah, it had wide appeal. Now, the way that he managed to do this before he was found out, and although some of the Gedolim later on, like the Ridvaz and the Ar Sameach, who write about him, criticize even his capabilities as a forger, which I guess is the ultimate insult after injury, meaning once you have no actual contribution and then you're not even a good forger, there's nothing left. So they criticize his ability as a forger, afilu. But here's the technique, so to speak, that he went with that endeared the Sefer to Gedolim and made it catch on. What he would look for is like unresolved shittas or unresolved things that are missing a makar amongst the Rishonim or similar to that, and he would create Yerushalmis that plugged holes that were needed. Meaning, for example, a gadol who learns chulin thoroughly and knows all the days of Rishonim and everything, Bizim Seif, there's going to be X amount, let's call it, for example, for argument's sake, 10, things that he has no resolution to, 10 shilas that he can't figure out how to make it all stem, can't resolve it all. And what Shlomo Yehuda Friedlander came and did is he organized these Yerushalmis to, so to speak, answer these questions, these outlying questions that Gedolim would have. Now, for example, and I want to open with this one, there's a Tosfos in Chulin on Daf Beis that brings down a halacha from a halacha as follows. The Mishnah in Chulin on Daf Beis says Hakol Sheichtim, right? Everyone's allowed to shecht. Now, we assume that includes even nashim could shecht, even women are allowed to shecht. Now, the first Tosfos in Masechtas Chulin, Tosfos brings as follows: Kasav b'Hilchos Eretz Yisrael. It says in Hilchos Eretz Yisrael as follows: the nashim le'yishchetum b'nei shedaitan kalas. Nashim can't shecht because they're daitan kalas. Ve'ein nira. Doesn't seem like that should be the halacha. That afilu b'mukdashim sheichlis l'chatchila k'taminim parakal apsum. The Gemara in Zvachim Daf Lamed Aleph says that women are allowed to shecht by Kodshim. So says Tosfos it should be a kal v'chomer. Malach by Kodshim women are allowed to shecht. For sure by Chulin they should be allowed to shecht. Kol apsum sheshachtu the evidin l'chatchila v'reminu v'shachim. The Tosfos continues. Well, fine. Fact Tosfos, that's Tosfos kasha number one. That if by Mukdashim they could shecht, then they should be able to shecht by Chulin also. Then Tosfos also points out that l'chayr seems to be connected our Mishnah, because the Mishnah says Hakol Sheichtin, which seems to be inclusive, even Nashim are included, which seems to be what the Mishnah is holding. And even though the Mishnah doesn't explicitly say Echad Anashim, like it says elsewhere, like the Mishnah and Tmura says in other places, still it seems to be a raya. So this is Tosfos' kasha on the Hilchos Eretz Yisrael, and it doesn't seem to stem with the Bavli, with the Sugis. Now, if you look in Friedlander's Kodshim, in Zvachim, in Perek Gimel Halacha Aleph, on Daf Yud Chesed Aleph, in his Madura, it says as follows: Rav Bun Bar Chia Boy Kumei de Rav Zera. Rav Bun Bar Chia had a shayla that he asked in front of Rav Zera. He says, Isha Mai B'Shchita. Is a woman allowed to shecht? Amar Lei, he said to him, Mai Daitach, what do you hold? Because Kodshim Mai Daitach said, what do you hold? Kodshim hi shechetes, chulin mi boilach. If she could shecht Kodshim, should it be a shayla that she should be allowed to shecht Kodshim? Meaning that she should be allowed to shecht chulin? It should be a kavachemer. Va'oid. So Amalei tells him, Shanya kahuna dezrizas yisera espe. No, kahuna in the Beis HaMikdash, that's a zrizas yisera over there. We're going to allow it, but not going to allow it b'chulim. Also over the Kumer Rishub ben Levi. So it says a story came from Rishub ben Levi. V'amar tzei re'ei hei chatzibur noyig. Go see what the tzibur does. Kol halacha shirefefes bezdin v'yat yedei mativir tzei re'ei chatzibur noyig v'noyig. Because he relies on this regular din. Now, the Marshal, this Yerushalmi, for example, B'miyash of this Tosfos, the Minchas Elazar quotes this. The Munkatcher Rebbe. Why? Because this was an open tab, so to speak, a Shvera Tosfos. The Tosfos brings the Deya that was unresolvable, that doesn't seem to stem with the Sugis and the Bavli, and finding a Mefurish Yerushalmi that addresses it almost with the exact Shakavatari of Tosfos was a marvelous find that Gedali Yisrael were excited about. Now, what he did over here is he really unraveled Tosfos and turned it into Yerushalmi. He took Tosfos' kashas, he took Tosfos' assumptions and kashas, and he turned that into a memory from the Yerushalmi. Now, one good find is great, but partly what was going to be a warning sign for the Gedali Yisrael later on was too many of these perfect finds. I'll show you a few more examples of how he does this. For example, this din as follows. There's a din that Nachri is not allowed to shecht. Now the Rambam in Hilchos Shchita in Perek Daled Alachid Aleph says, Nachri sheshachat shchitas in nevela. A Nachri that shecht, the shchitas in nevela. Shenamar, the Rambam brings a pasuk, V'kara l'cha v'achalta mizivchai. which means Hayos the Torah was mazer you not to eat from when a guy invites you to eat in his house. So kilu kavachemer not to eat from a shechita. Frek the Rosh in Chulin in the first paragraph in Simon Hey, he says I don't understand. The Torah told you when he calls you not to eat from his zevach. So the halacha that the Rambam is bringing is not an accurate halacha. It's not what it's talking about. Hare that ilu yishchat anachi chutz lebeisa yemut lechem mizivchay. So the Rosh brings another makar, and the Rosh says v'zavachta v'achalta. Anyone who bar zvicha is bar. Only someone who's bar achil is bar zvicha. That's what the Rosh brings. Now the Rambam is the shver Rambam. He's bringing a source that isn't in the Bavli. There's no Gemara that says this, and the Rosh, aptly points out that there's no makar for this. Now, I think that Nachman Lakasher, one of his svarim, brings that there's a makar from Mechilta de Rashbi, and it seems to be he has an article, like a whole collection of halachas that the Rambam sources like exclusively from Mechilta de Rashbi. But Yich Shia in the Yerushalmi on Kodshim that Freelander created in Perak Aleph and Halacha Beis and Davav Mir Aleph, it says as follows: Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Omer, Taima de Masnisan that Shchitas Guy is Nevela. May Hadain Kraya from this pasuk. Pentichreis bris liyoshvei aretz v'zanu acher elihei v'karasa l'chav v'achaltam izivchay. Exactly like the Rambam says. So Friedlander again took a obscure shita. That's a Rambam that Talmidei Chachamim was struggling to answer the Rosh's kasha. The Rosh was asking good kasha, what's the makar for this? He took a imaginary Yerushalmi and he creates a maramakim for it. Or for example, maybe one or two more of this, just to highlight the creative style that he's using over here. There's a shita that the Bahag has. The Bahag in Hilchas Treifus has a shita as follows. He says, Nitla hamara, if the gallbladder is missing from an animal, karinon lekaved beduchta, we tear open the liver that's near the area, v'taminon imarir ksheira v'iloi treif, we test. If it's like a salty taste, you do like a licking test. If it's a salty taste, then we assume that there was a gallbladder and just disappeared now, and the animal's kosher. V'iloi treifa. The Ramban is masig in this, and he says, Elu different He doesn't understand where this comes from. There's no makar for this. What's the source of this? There's no Gemara that says this. Where did the Bahag learn this halacha that this is an appropriate method to test for a missing gallbladder? So if you look in Friedland's Yerushalmi, right on schedule in Elu Treifus and Halach Aleph in the third parak of Chulun and Halach Aleph and Daf and Aleph, it says as follows: Reb Yochanan and Reb Shimon ben Lakish have a yasvim bebeis va'ada. Aisun kumayun chad kavda. They brought in front of them a kaved lemeshtakach beimara that they couldn't find the gallbladder. Tam Reb Yochanan kavda belishna. He tasted the liver with his tongue. V'tam b'mirusi. He tasted some sort of sour taste, some sort of salty taste. Amar hamara bekavda elisa. Oh, Vaistes, the gallbladder got subsumed and absorbed by the liver, and this is really a kosher animal. So kulu chiyusa ragzenisan kain havyan, and all animals that are ragzanim, that are I don't know how you type that word exactly right now, are their mara could be subsumed by the kavod. So here you have again a shver bahag that the Ramban is chaylik on, and that dairis of Talmidei Chachamim struggle to understand and zuch for a makar, comes along the Yerushalmi with an imaginary source, and right there you have it, done, settled. And these were the type of things that were so attractive to the Gedolei Yisrael, who Pasha drank it up, meaning like Grace Sigainim, like the Klichemda and the Ostrov Sigain and Rucham Feshel Perla and etc. just drank up this Yerushalmi because it was the solution to so many problems. Now, eventually, if the Yerushalmi is conveniently answering Shver Zachin too often, that itself becomes an indication of sorts that something's not correct, that someone's lying here. Meaning because it can't be right every single time. It can't suddenly be creating all the answers to all these long-standing questions. And eventually the Gedolei Yisrael started realizing that this was something that was lucky and fraud. It couldn't be something that was real. Now, besides for that, there's the famous, the Rogatchover's input and others. Now, in the Shalosh Shlem Yerushalayim, the Klichemda collects various letters from Gedolim who supported him. And it's interesting, he's kind of cautious. He writes that he came across this Yerushalmi with a Pirush Cheshek Shlema, and I want to just read you what he says, because this is a little bit of myth busting. He says, Amnam, Heyoisa la yiris Esreimus me'rav mefarish lefi asher isi b'askamas hagoyin amovik av bezdin berajan shekasav la v'zeh alashon l'chein la Yehudim ha'isa'ira v'aleinu levarach yotzar ha'ma'iris acher shekam v'nesaydad harav hagoyin hagad la maforsim chacham v'shalom v'shalem Yehuda al-Gazi ha'machuna Friedlander asher hoitzi la'aretz kol siddur Yerushalmi Pirush Cheshek Shlema asher kol gedolei hadar yishamchu v'yitnenu hoid v'had l'shmoy l'zichur. The Marsham writes that all the Gedolim Shabechet and whatever. Mili says that the Kli Chemda says, I'm afraid to go up against what the Marshal's writing and what it seems like. And then in the next paragraph he brings Kol, and in parentheses, Loi Rak Roiv, Kol, Gedei Le'adoi, Shabchon V'yitnu Hoid V'had L'shmoi. Ulezois Mi Anoichi L'har Achro V'Talisi Achsarim Bi. He says, I fell for it, because the Marsham writes, and this was borne out by the reality, that the Gedolim were excited about this. They found great pleasure in this. He says, and when I realized, slowly, it started to creep into me that something's not right over here. And then he came across the real, information about him, etc. And he says, I reached out to him, and I said, all I need from you is just provide me some receipts. Just show me, send me some of the Ksev Yad, show me so that I could, rest my mind. And after all the excuses, and it was not forthcoming, I realized that it was obviously wrong. And then he proceeds to show his correspondence with various Gedolim, where he requests from them either the ability, the question, like should he continue looking for this and try to go through it. And he corresponds with the Sachachavar, he corresponds with the Imre Amos' brother on behalf of the Imre Amos, he corresponds with the Avstraf Sigoyin, with both Rabbanim of Dvinsk, he corresponds with Chalkas Yair from Kinsk, and it makes for interesting reading all these Chuvas. I'm not going to go through them in detail now. Each one of them has its own particular flavor of the Gedolim who interjected, and managed to put to rest the idea that this Yerushalmi was an authentic find and prove that it was a fraud. Now there's obviously much more to go into in the details of this Yerushalmi. There's many more examples of what we were giving of kashas that it answered and einfalls and holes that it plugged. But I think this is we'll hold it here, and perhaps Oid Chazayin L'Moed we'll circle back to this. Maybe we'll talk about other Svarim and other similar Shilas.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.